Microphone on.
Microphone on. Forgot about that. Well, tēnā tātou katoa ngā iwi, nau mai haere mai ki te Wellington City Council Climate Change Adaptation Workshop. Kua tai mai nei ki tēnei wahi ki te kōrero i ngā kaupapa. Ki te rohi taurikura, ki te taranaki whānui, te ati awa, me Ngāti Toa Rangatira, mō tō koutou mana wānui. Ki te haere mai, ki te tautoko mai, e pā ana i tēnei kaupapa. Ka nui taka mihi mahana, ngā mihi kia koutou, kia whakaronga mai, e tēnei rā, tēnā tātou katoa. So before we kick off today, I might just open us up with a quick karakia, just to get us going. Kia tau, ngā manaakitanga, ati mea ngaro, ki runga, ki tēnā o tātou, kia mahia, te hua mā kihikihi, kia toi te kupu, toi te mana, toi te aroha, toi te reo Māori, kia tūturu, ka whakamaua, kia tīna, hui e, tā ki e. Ka pai. Well, thank you very much for joining us for this workshop today. We've been really excited to be able to sit in front of you and give us an update, give you an update on the work that we've been doing in the climate change response team on adaptation. And yeah, really looking forward to getting into some awesome kōrero. So before I take us through the purpose and the agenda today, I'm going to hand it over to Liam to open us up with some thoughts and some overall direction. So kia ora, Liam, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, man. Awesome. Hey, really pleased to bring this workshop to everyone. I mean, it's been a point of conversation today, just this morning, talking about flooding issues in Tawa and how climate and its change will affect people on the ground in real terms. I would probably hasten to say that this is probably one of the more important pieces of work we've done and are about to do for the city. An adaptation plan is no mean thing. It is a national issue, and communities at all levels are struggling with what the impact of climate change will have on them, not only their communities, but the social, economic and environmental profile of their communities, which they all care deeply about. So we don't expect to have any answers today. We're just trying to map a road forward for everyone to get to a point where we can hand on heart in the next term, more than likely adopt a climate adaptation plan. So yeah, really pleased and stoked that the team are where they are today. And Jamuna's online, I take it. Hello, Jamuna. Yes, very good. And I'll leave it over to the team to kick off.
Ka pai, thank you, Liam. So before we jump into the purpose and agenda, I'm just wanting to quickly introduce the team that is going to be running us through this today. So to start, kia ora, ko Kaden Tokunua, Hiria hei no Ngāti Tū. Ngāti Maniapoto Huki. I'm a contractor in the team and have the pleasure of working with my amazing colleagues on this really, really important mahi that we're going to go through today. So kia ora, I'll hand it over to Alison to introduce herself next.
You guys have met me. I don't think I've met you. I'm Alison. I'm the manager of the Climate Change Response Business Unit. Jamuna?
Kia ora koutou, ko Jamuna Rotstein toku ingoa. I am the Principal Advisor for Climate Change Adaptation, and it is a real pleasure to be here with you today. Sorry, I can't see any of you while I've got my slides sharing, so but I've got Alison and Caden in the room to be my eyes and ears there. Lovely to be here.
Ka pai. Michaela, would you want to go next to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Kia ora tātou, ko tangata kia te monga, ko te whanganui atara te moana, no te whanganui atara aho, ko Aspel toko whānau, ko Michaela toko ingoa, tēnā koutou katoa. Lovely to be here. My name is Michaela Aspel. I'm a Senior Climate Change Consultant at Paddle Delamore Partners here in Wellington, and I've been helping Caden and Jamuna with some of the adaptation strategy and also with the submission on the draft national adaptation plan.
Ka pai, thank you, Michaela. And then we have Sean Ordain also joining us. So Sean, if you want to introduce yourself.
Good afternoon. My name's Sean Ordain. I'm the Strategic Planning Manager, and I've also had a number of jobs here at the Council, including being in charge of innovation and intelligence after earthquakes and civil defence emergencies, which is more what I'll be talking about today.
Bye. Ka pai, thank you, Sean. Awesome. So Jamuna, could you push us on to the next slide, please? Awesome. So we have two key purposes that we're going to go through today. So our first one is to provide an overview of the submission on the Ministry for Environment's Draft National Adaptation Plan and Managed Retreat. And then the second half is going to be focused on an outline of Wellington City Council's climate change adaptation work program, including timelines and key steps in delivering and developing the adaptation strategy. Awesome. Cool. So to just give you a little breakdown on how that's going to go. So we've split this up primarily into two key sections of this workshop. So the first section will be a bit of a whakapapa into what's already happened in the adaptation workspace already, and then we're going to dive a little bit into climate and policy changes and the submission on Ministry for Environment's National Adaptation Plan and Managed Retreat. After those sections, we're going to pause for a break and go through a few questions. We're going to allocate 5 to 10 minutes to that. And then we're going to move to Te Atakura adaptation update, which is more focused on how our work plan is going. And again, we'll take a bit of time to take some questions for that as well. There is a great amount of content that we're looking to get through today. So keeping in mind that this is not the last time that you're going to be hearing from us. This is an ongoing conversation. But yeah, we're very, very keen to get your input and feedback on what we're presenting to you today.
And we were planning originally this workshop was going to be only on sort of what our process was for developing the council's adaptation strategy and plan. But then the National Adaptation Plan came out, so we've repurposed this workshop. So we're trying to do two things in the same slot. So we're more than happy to come back and keep talking. The National Adaptation Plan submission is due on the 3rd of June, so that's why we're having this workshop now. We're hoping to get a steer from you that you're happy with the key messages, so that we can feed those into regional and national submission processes as well, without needing to wait for a formal council sign-off of those key messages. So it's enabling us to amplify our voice by having this conversation nice and early.
Ka pai. Awesome. Thanks, Alison. So moving into the next session, I'm going to pass it over to Sean to take us through the whakapapa of what's happened in adaptation. Kia ora, Sean.
Thank you. So what I'm going to do is take us through what the last 10 years has looked like, just picking on particular projects where we've learnt something, we've made an advance, or something really interesting in the adaptation space has happened. These are by no means an exhaustive list, and this work is endlessly fascinating, so do feel free to ask questions or take me aside later. But the first point I'd make is that the city has always been in a state of adaptation. This is something we made for the opening of the National Library. So on the left you see Pipitea Pa. This was a thing where you could fly around the city and basically compare what over 100 years of change looked like. And as you can see, it's extensive. And if we move forward, so the next slide, you start to see how the complexities of a city happen. You have to remember that a city is the most complex thing us humans create, and now the most complex natural process that we've ever encountered is acting on it. This means that the relationships between things that we have previously treated as separate or distinct because of their own complexities now begin to really matter. So an example is on the left is an extract from the underground twin. The pipes and things beneath our streets. The depth of those pipes is determined by the height of that wall and the sea against it, down at the lagoon. And so when you start to think about the purposes that those pipes are serving, their lifespans being tied to the environments they're in, the living standards they enable, you begin to see the true complexity of climate change and the challenge that adaptation is posing for us and for every city around the world. So the next slide. This is what that complexity looks like when you map it against different dimensions. And so the way I would like to think about city planning is, imagine I tied every single thing in this room together with pieces of string, just like these concepts are tied together. And then I moved this cup. We wouldn't necessarily know what would come flying off a shelf and who would get hit in the face. And that's the kind of process we're in at the moment, is understanding what is actually tied to what? Where can we create the flex in our systems? And how can we manage our way through this so that the people who can least afford it and are most vulnerable to it aren't necessarily stretched and hurt? So if we move to the next slide. my first encounter with practical adaptation was this project. In 2014, a large storm bashed a hole in the Island Bay seawall. I do apologise if this is triggering for some councillors. You should have tried being an officer. What we did is we ran through a process with the community with different options for what could happen. They ranged from building an entirely new wall to removing the road and reinstating the dunes. There's a few things we learnt along the way. One of them was just how many different value systems are acting in a decision like this. The other was time. The eventual process was to essentially glue the piece of wall back into place. Knowing that the asset life of the surrounding infrastructure would mean that the decision would need to be made in about 20 years' time. And so that meant we could get the life out of the asset around it, satisfy the immediate concerns of the community. But it also meant that there was now a decision point that would have to be taken in the future to adapt. So if we move to the next slide. Taking that lesson of how do we understand systems and how do we understand democracy, we started work on this. This is one of the very first of its kind. It was a virtual reality version of the city. What you're seeing there is the old shoreline and the streams beneath the city. What this meant is we could immerse people in the realities of sea level rise. Sorry, I've just realised that's a bit of a dad joke. But what we found was when people could play with the sea levels and experience storms in Wakefield Street, they suddenly began to understand what it meant at a basic level and then start to ask about what it meant for the pipes. What did saturated soils mean for liquefaction potential? What else changed? And we noticed a real change in the dynamic of engagement, and that was ultimately one of the tools we have used with the First to Zero project, First to Zero strategy, Te Atakura, the Resilience strategy, and the Makara project. So if we move to the next slide. In 2018, many of you will remember the Makara project. This was triggered by Cyclone Gita coming down from the tropics and basically smashing the infrastructure out there. What this gave us an opportunity to do was to sit down with the community, with scientists and other public agencies, and work out what an adaptive pathway looked like on the ground. The groups co-designed a plan for Makara's future, and you can look at it on our website. We learnt an enormous amount about public engagement from this process, and we also began to understand the challenge we would face as we tried to scale these kinds of actions both across the city's many communities, but also across time. And so if we move to the next slide, we start to get into the present day where we've been working on the city twin. Now, it might seem a bit strange to invest in a digital thing to help with climate change, but what it does is it helps us visualize and understand what is happening in our environment, both the systems we can see and the systems we can't. Just for interest, the red and green dots are all of the parking spaces that are occupied at that particular moment. Don't worry, they're not buildings I'm going to demolish. Councillors always with the political divisions. But this is fracturing into several other projects to understand what's beneath our feet, to understand what the climate, that complex system as it is imposed on this city looks like, and also things like transport and the cultural social values and how we can express them. This is the work that's been funded by the Bloomberg Global Mayors Challenge. So you'll be aware, along with a few other cities in the world, we've been granted monies. That money is to basically apply this technology to the challenge of climate adaptation. And that a organisation like Bloomberg would fund a city at the bottom of the world to do this, shows that we have been learning as we're going, but also the desperate challenge that trying to scale into climate change presents cities worldwide. So if we go to the next slide, you have my particular obsession at the moment, the district plan. And so if you read carefully into the district plan, you'll see inundation zones. The two zones have the effect of raising floor levels, but also the high hazard area restricts new development. And so what that does, it does allow people who have houses in that area to do work on them, but it does restrict the densification along the coastlines. And so you're seeing the beginnings of regulatory response. And so if we move to the next slide, you've got what we've learned. The key lessons are essentially is that we can do this. We are recognised globally for our climate leadership, but like many small cities, it's in particular categories we really excel at. The challenge for us is we need to move the entirety of our systems to confront this challenge, not just lead from one or two advances. We've also learnt that we need to see the links between systems and the life they support are often invisible. We have to find ways to understand them and bring them into the light. This does have the advantage of bringing new understandings and new ways of solving problems to bear on previously intractable problems. And we have to look at the underlying systems and understand them. We have to understand that financial, digital, and social understandings are the determinants of being able to make wise and just decisions as we sustain stresses and shocks. Essentially, if we can't sustain decision-making over long periods of time, we will be unable to act and confront this challenge. There's also a need to balance. I can tell you from our civil defence response that we're very good at responding to shocks. But the difficulty is, as we respond to shocks, are we disguising stresses, those long-term effects that ultimately mean that we are not in a position to meet the future? And so that, as governors, is a big challenge because we do have to meet the need where it is, but at the same time we must plan for the long term. There is also a need to scale. We have been extraordinarily good at exploring and finding a way. But most of the initiatives I've shown you have hit a wall at some point because we couldn't figure out what's next. It was difficult to fund. There was changes. We need to scale at the face of the problem we're trying to confront. And frankly, there is no problem in the world scaling faster than climate change at present. So if we go to the next slide, I realise what I've taken you through is a little bit grim. So I would like to remind you that ultimately in these dark times, none of us ever wanted to be in a position where we confronted a hazard like this, but it is not for us to decide that. All we have to do is figure out what we do with this time that is given to us and how we will adapt. Thank you.
That was inspiring.
Kapai, thank you, Sean. That was awesome. I'm going to hand it over to Jamuna now to walk us through the changes ahead. Kapai, thanks, Jamuna.
Kia ora. Kia ora, Caden, and kia ora, Sean, for the last section. Promise you today is not all about doom and gloom. We will get to a point that is hopefully much more about thinking about a more hopeful, resilient future. But this next little section, we will focus a little bit more on the doom and gloom, just to remind us of some of the big changes that we have coming up for us from a climate change perspective, but also from a policy perspective as well, that really helps to set the context of our adaptation planning process. So just, I know that we all know this. We know that climate change is already affecting Wellington, and that the projections for climate change on Wellington mean that there'll be a future of more extreme weather events and a whole range of direct and indirect impacts on the city. As Sean was talking about, there's a range of shocks and stresses that we need to plan for. We know that being a coastal city, that sea level rise is a particular vulnerability for us. And we know that sea level rise is affecting Wellington particularly badly compared to the rest of New Zealand. we know that we need to plan for some pretty significant changes to our coastal environments, and that even small changes in sea level rise is going to have a big impact on how we will need to respond. We know that, for example, as the sea levels rise, that there'll be increases to the severity of storm surge events, particularly with tidal events as well. And we know that the problem is not just about what's going to happen in the future, but there are also changes that we're already having to deal with in the short term. We know that the central city area, as well as Kilburnie and Seatoun and the south coast, are particularly vulnerable to these changes. And so we're going to have to come up with clever ways for how to respond at scale. And just to also, I guess, contextualize ourselves with so it's not just the changes to our climate and environment that we need to consider in our adaptation planning. We're also aligning with some of the big changes coming in central government policy as well. So we know that there's some pretty big pieces of policy reform affecting local government and how we respond from a climate change adaptation perspective. We know that there's the local government review happening over the next few years that's going to potentially change the roles and functions of local government, including things like funding arrangements. There's also the Three Waters reform, which will take effect in a couple of years. So that's going to have particular impact on the stormwater, or all of the water infrastructure, and create, I guess, new challenges for us, given that the Three Waters infrastructure is some of the most vulnerable infrastructure that we have to the effects of sea level rise and wider climate change impacts. And there's also the reform of the RMA, the replacement of the RMA with 3 separate acts, which will all, once they're all in place, will substantially help us to adapt to climate change. With the Natural and Built Environment Act and the Spatial Planning Act, they'll take us a long way for avoiding future risks, ensuring that we're not developing in high-risk areas. But it's really the creation of the Climate Adaptation Act that will really help us to deal with the existing challenges of existing infrastructure. But there's a lot of unknowns with all of these pieces of reform. For example, with the Climate Adaptation Act, we've known that has been on the cards for a long time, but there's been very little guidance about what will actually be in that legislation. We do have the first thoughts from the government about what that might entail, that has been released alongside the draft National Adaptation Plan, which we'll hear more about just shortly. And so the last, I guess, big piece of policy change from a national government perspective that I wanted to mention was the release of the draft National Adaptation Plan, which came out a few weeks ago. And so we are just about to go into all of those details. So we'll unpack all of those changes shortly. But really, this is the first national version of an adaptation plan that's been created for Aotearoa, which will provide us with, I guess, some direction about how we can coordinate nationally and more regionally as well. So
Ka pai, Jimena, thank you very much. What an amazing segue, actually, into passing over to Michaela to talk us through the submission, Wellington City Council submission on the draft National Adaptation Plan and Managed Retreat. Michaela, I'll pass the rako over to you. Kia ora.
Kia ora, thank you, Caden. I'm actually just going to throw the ball back to Jamuna just for this first slide. She's going to talk you through the submission process from Wellington City Council.
Yeah, thanks, Michaela. That's right. So hopefully you've all seen that the draft National Adaptation Plan was released a couple of weeks ago. We've been working hard behind the scenes to try and get some feedback on the draft. So just to explain the process of getting the submission in to you, we are presenting the high-level findings to you today for discussion. And after the workshop today, we'll obviously take on feedback and continue to get further feedback on specific elements of the submission with other officers and hopefully mana whenua as well. We're working towards a deadline of the 26th of May to get you the full submission. It's quite a lengthy piece of work. There are 72 questions and they're all quite detailed. So yeah, working towards the 26th of May and we'll have until the 3rd of June to submit the submission to Ministry for Environment. So I will hand back to you, Michaela.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to attempt to, in a not too dry way, summarise what we have seen in this draft National Adaptation Plan and also our sort of key thoughts that we are using to shape the submission. So just starting with what the draft National Adaptation Plan covers. So first of all, this is the first in a series of 6 yearly adaptation plans that will be published every 2 years following the latest National Climate Change Risk Assessment. And this has been set out in the Climate Change Zero Carbon Response Act Amendment of 2019. So we had our first National Climate Change Risk Assessment released in 2020, which detailed 43 priority risks around climate change from the government. And this National Adaptation Plan attempts to address those risks and start setting the overall adaptation strategy for Aotearoa. And together with the Emissions Reductions Plan, which we had the final release of yesterday, these two documents form the overarching response to climate change in New Zealand. The circle diagram on the left, if you can read it, shows how the plan fits into the adaptation response. Keep going. Oh, thanks, Jamina. Oh, no, sorry, we'll go back to the first slide. Yeah, cool. So the circle diagram shows how the plan fits into the adaptation response. So that's the green box on the right, and it's as part of the climate change risk assessment, as well as guiding principles for implementation and monitoring and indicators to measure. They all feed into this ongoing process of assessing, planning, implementing and monitoring that is required for adaptation as information changes, as science changes, as effects changes, and we monitor adaptation. So the plan contains 2 sections on climate adaptation and resilience and on managed retreat, and feeding into these both is the incorporation of the Raiora framework developed with Ihirangi, which promotes a holistic and te ao Māori view of climate change. The associated consultation document that we're working on, like Jamuna says, has a total of 72 questions, with about half of these on managed retreat. Next slide, please, Jamuna. Lovely. So speaking of managed retreat, does form part of this consultation document. It itself is an approach to reduce or eliminate exposure to intolerable risks. So this phrase is coming up a lot in this draft National Adaptation Plan, the concept of intolerable risk. And you'll see in the the little diagram that we've got retreat as one of the three options there of protecting, accommodating, or deciding that the risk is no longer tolerable and retreating. And the managed retreat section relates to critical actions of the National Adaptation Plan, including reform of the resource management system, passing legislation to support managed retreat, and developing options for home flood insurance issues. The government has not yet decided on a preferred policy option to address the managed retreat problem, and they do say that central government will not bear every risk and cost of climate change, including climate change adaptation. Instead, this will fall across different parts of society, and they have singled out local government as a current leader in the space, and being sort of the main leader in the future with managed retreat processes. So under the Resource Management System, the proposed Natural and Built Environments Act and Strategic Planning Act will help enable long-term proactive planning for managed retreat, whereas separate legislation, so the Climate Adaptation Act, the third in those three reforms, is intended to provide tools and processes to plan and implement managed retreats. So there's 5 key sections about managed retreat, and these are the focuses for the government. That's establishing a process for initiation and planning, preparing, enabling investment, active retreat, cleanup and repurposing of abandoned land, establishing roles and responsibilities, and like I said, acknowledging that local government has a leading role to play particularly in the planning, decision-making aspects and engaging with community. Thirdly is property transfer, so the sort of legal aspects of finding new land to move to and what happens to the land that has been retreated from. Implications for Māori through both land transfer, the unique cultural and social systems that connect Māori to land, as well as exposed coastal communities, and more information is sought from MFE in this space. And lastly, the role that insurance might play in managed retreat. So we'll then move on to the main document, the Draft National Adaptation Plan, and this I've just split this into sort of 3 areas here. So first we have the focus areas, which are on reforming institutions, providing data, information and guidance, and embedding climate resilience across government strategies and policies. The plan is then split further, so those 6 chapters have actions and objectives under each of them, and they are on system-wide actions, and then natural environment, homes, building and places, infrastructure, communities, and economy and finance system. The system-wide outcome and areas inform transformative change required across all systems, which has been identified as legislation and institutional arrangements, robust information about climate risks, tools, guidance and methodologies, and unlocking the investment in climate resilience. And under each of the chapters are actions which are either already planned and contribute to climate change adaptation, like the aforementioned Resource Management Act reforms, like the Department of Conservation's National Adaptation Plans. So things that already are underway, they are included in this, as well as proposed actions to address climate change adaptation, and such actions relevant to local government include, among many, guidance on developing adaptation plans, further guidance on the dynamic adaptive pathways planning process, which Wellington City Council has a bit of experience with through the Makara adaptation project, improving natural hazard information on LIM reports to include climate change hazards, and the prioritisation of nature-based solutions for climate change adaptation strategies. And interestingly, that was also one of the key focus areas of the recent emissions reductions plan, so opportunities for crossover in both those spaces. So if you just take me to the next slide, please, Jamuna. We've got it's always good to start with some positives. Anyone who likes to do a compliment sandwich email would know. So we've identified a few things Just to start off with in our submission, we are taking the opportunity to commend MFE on the draft National Adaptation Plan as the first of its kind yet in New Zealand, and it's important not to overlook the significance of its development and starting to really address the key risks from climate change. In particular, the following key points up on the slides we support in relation to climate change adaptation for local government. So that's actions to pass legislation on managed retreats, the Climate Adaptation Act, setting strategic national direction and guidance via the National Planning Framework, which will come through the Natural and Built Environments Act, the establishment of an adaptation data sharing portal, with the outcome being to have a national hub of all available climate data and information. And I think the goal here is also to link this into EQC's risk and hazard sharing portal, supporting mana whenua with their own climate change initiatives, and also the incorporation of Te Ao Māori throughout the draft NAP, in particular the number of questions which I suppose MFE is really seeking feedback to make sure they're on the right track in this area. And strengthening the emergency management system, although this is often called the ambulance under the cliff. Emergency management plays a key role in future climate change response as the intensity and frequency of storms increase, and it's important we have systems in place to act when these events do occur. However, the draft NAP is heavily reliant on local government, but doesn't provide answers for the key issues which have been identified time and time again by local government in the climate adaptation space. So moving on to some of the key, our key feedback points identified on the draft National Adaptation Plan, so that's that main document. So the first is encouraging the government to be more ambitious in providing clear leadership and coordination of system-wide transformative change. We don't get a feeling of leadership coming through into this document, and it leaves quite a bit of flexibility in defining roles and responsibilities, in particular in relation to implementing climate change adaptation and funding. The second is providing clear funding mechanisms, so leading through from that leadership. Of course, we all know that money is extremely important in implementing actions, and the extent of funding required for climate change adaptation is not possible under the existing funding arrangements, and we need to signal that to central government. The third is prioritising the resourcing and development of actions listed in the draft National Adaptation Plan that support local governments. So there are a number of actions with different timeframes ranging from next year, the year after, to 6 years' time. And so this is all about prioritising those which are really important for local government climate change adaptation so that it doesn't delay action from the local government space any further. Fourth is providing greater resourcing to enable mana whenua to co-govern and or realise hapu and iwi adaptation priorities. Although that is identified as something in the plan, the resourcing and funding of how this will be done is not clarified. The fifth point there, addressing land use planning barriers for local government. Currently there is a lack of implementation support for managed retreat in planning instruments. And the draft NAP needs to address this to, at the least, provide for flexible planning regimes and the power to modify existing land uses and permits. And 6, recognise that local communities and mana whenua need to be part of creating local solutions. And I'd say we need to go a step further and say they need to be leading a lot of those local solutions in that space. And we're encouraging central government to recognise that the primary role in climate change adaptation is facilitating and supporting local government to enable that to happen. And then we have our next 4 points, which focus on the managed retreat space. And that is a more coherent national statutory policy framework and funding mechanism to enable proactive locally led managed retreat. The next point is ensuring colonisation is not perpetuated through managed retreat approaches, particularly through that land transfer mechanisms, and making sure that climate change adaptation decisions are not being made for people, they're either being made with or on behalf. The third point there, including processes for managing origin land. So that's the land being moved from, and for selecting and developing destination land. That's if we are going through managed retreat, that's the land that's being moved to. In particular, opportunities for origin land, for example, for biodiversity and climate change mitigation benefits, and how the selection and development of destination land will be undertaken, provided for via planning instruments and funding. And lastly, we have just recommended that the language of managed retreat is reconsidered, because this may alarm communities instead of enabling productive engagement approaches that could be framed around making room for nature, accommodating rising seas, or relocation towards safer and more resilient spaces. So these are our 10 main points forming the front end of the submission, and they will of course be backed up by more detailed submissions through those 72 questions, which are also getting wider council feedback from different staff in areas at Wellington City Council. And today, Jamuna and other staff members and myself are seeking feedback, so wondering if the points I've just stated are clear, if this seems to be like the right direction to be moving forward with the submission, and if there are any other areas that you feel were not mentioned throughout the proposal. And I'll hand over Jamuna to facilitate questions, or Caden, for this time. Thank you.
Ka pai. Thanks, Michaela. I'll jump in here real quickly. So that concludes the formal presentation part of the first section of this workshop. Just before we kick off with that, Councillor Poihoa, I heard you saying at the beginning that this was a process that you were comfortable in running. Should I pass that over to you then?
Nah, it was just because Iona wasn't here and she usually chairs the planning and environment stuff, but I think it's probably better that someone in the room facilitates it, because we can't see on the screen, but Iona's just got her hand up for a question online, and then you might have people in real life. So yeah, is that okay? Is that all good? And I can just let you know what's going on online?
Sounds good.
I'm happy to just supervise or help facilitate the questions, if that works. Yeah.
Yeah, can you see the hands up though, Sarah?
Yeah, I can see Iona's got one up at the minute. So Iona.
We can only see your hands up if your cameras are on in the room. That's the trick. If your camera's off and your hands up, we won't see it.
Okay, so I can now see that we've got Iona and Tam and Laurie. So should we do that order?
Yep. So thanks, team. That's looking good. A few things. I would like the submission to go to a committee rather than me signing it off, or Tam. So I'm just wondering if that could go to whichever committee is before the 26th of May, if there is one.
So the reason why, Jamuna, what is the exact timing? Can you flick back to that slide? I think there's a misalignment between the due date of the submission and the committees. So we weren't able to, we're just not able to write it in time to get it to the next PEC, and then it's due before the one after that. So it's impossible to do the timing.
You just send it to any committee.
But any committee can. So maybe just ask Democracy Services.
We have asked, as have most local governments, if we could have an extension, and they're being adamant that we can't. And but it's really annoying when they do really tight timeframes because of those sign-off processes. So yep, we'll do that. We'll slot it in somewhere.
Okay, I appreciate that. Next question. I am deeply interested in the cost allocation model that government will have to adopt. And I do have a view that everyone needs to pay, given that most people have contributed to climate change in some way. So I just want to, and also that local government will not have the resources to be able to, pay for all the damage from storms or whatever, and compensate people when they are impacted by storms and other adverse weather events, or chronic sea level rise. So I guess I just would like some more detail about how we're going to deal with that. I think we need a very, very, very strong message to government. And insurance is going to be tricky, right? Because, that they can rightly say that they've warned us for years about climate change. So we should have planned better. So could I
So
just have a
on a-
response to that?
Yeah, so I'll take that if that's okay. Yeah, sure. Madam Chair, I'm just pretending. The question of who pays is not answered in the National Adaptation Plan. So they have kicked that can down the road to the Climate Change Adaptation Act, and they haven't even outlined like potential ideas yet. So they're not testing any ideas yet. They haven't given us any guidance. We have drafted a bullet point that, you know, please tell us what the funding and financing options are that you're going to do. We can make that stronger if that's something that, you know, that you as a group of councillors would like us to be stronger on. One of my key concerns with adaptation is that if we funded everything via local government without central government support, it will send local government as an institution nationwide broke. Like, there's just not enough money to do that. So I do think it is worth making a strong point that this is that the cost should be shared between central government, local government and individual property owners.
That sounds good. And I guess obviously that should be done in the context of local government reform, right? Where planning decisions are supposed to be regionalised more.
So
just my last
comfortable. So if there are any councillors who aren't comfortable with that point, please let us know. But we can strengthen that point in there, that we would like to see more. You know, we're looking forward to the funding and financing chapter and the cost share model.
Yeah,
I think the differences would probably be, just to jump in as one of the few right-wing people I can see here, the differences would probably come in where we view the cost share should lie. So some councillors would probably view that private property owners should bear a greater percentage of the cost. Other councillors would believe that central government should bear a greater percentage of the cost. I think there probably will be political agreement that those three parties all have to share.
Okay.
I think the political disagreement would be who
what
pays
percentage?
how much.
Yeah, and I think that argument will be had at central government level, not by us. Okay.
Sure. But I think
so I guess just the point then is that that we need a very it's not even, I don't think we're at the answering that, but we need a good process and very rigorous analysis to shape that, to figure out what's fair. Just the last point. Sean, your comments were kind of interesting. I mean, look, from my perspective, this institution has also contributed to climate change problems by doing various things over the years. So I hope from now on that, you know, we really do take responsibility when we're, you know, taking money from airports or building tunnels or not doing enough on waste or whatever. So that possibly doesn't need a response, but I do want to put that challenge down that it sometimes is really difficult to do climate change work in this context because we get a lot of pushback.
Yeah, I
hope that's noted.
Noted.
Thank you.
Just don't quite know how much time we've got in there. I've now got Jill and Fleur wanting to ask questions as well. So I think we do need to sort of keep the speed up. Tam.
We've got another hour and 10 minutes, so it should be sweet. Yeah. Thanks, Sarah. So, hey, Sean, I was interested to know, just because we not skipped past it, but we passed your presentation without the chance to ask questions, but I was interested to know, are you the only one at council that has the knowledge of how to do the digital city stuff? Because, like, you've obviously been the one leading that and the kind of face of that work to us, and then you kind of talked a bit about how that digital cities will be a big part of our adaptation planning. But I just wondered, like, how embedded is that knowledge throughout the institution? And if you were to leave, would that still be able to be carried on through other people?
He's not allowed to leave.
First of all, what have you got planned?
I agree.
For
No.
councillors? No. Any sort of knowledge that can't be transmitted through an organisation is essentially just a magic trick. So I have been teaching apprentices and a number of young professionals how to do this. We are also working our way through our mana whenua partners with working out how we can apprentice this knowledge into their organisations and get a better understanding of digital tikanga as well. So, in short, yes, there are others, but you probably haven't met them yet.
We also have a project team working on the Bloomberg prize that we won in that project. So there's a good, I don't know, Jamuna, 6-8 people in the standing project team, and we did a risk assessment just the other day looking at, all of those things.
Yeah. I mean, and the Sean's far too polite, but Sean's now the manager of strategic planning, and when I saw the Fit for the Future work through, given the amount of resources Council gave us for the Cycleways program and for strategic planning more generally, Sean's been appointed to take his digital sense to a planning level that we can all use in a comprehensive way. That digital twin will be our foundation to understand how we plan into the future. So I'm really looking forward to seeing him stretch out and get that City Insights team humming whilst we get the proposed plan through its statutory process. But yeah, always seen as a flight risk, but we've moved to hold on to him.
Cool. And then my other question, sorry, I've got two more, so maybe I should get through them. Sorry. My other question was, we get asked quite a bit in the central city about how we're preparing for sea level rise, like especially around like the Tingako area and stuff like that. So I guess in light of the information about sea level rise and how it's happening faster than we might have thought, what are the timelines for that? And when I go out into my community, what can I tell them about adaptation within the central city?
So we're about in the second half of this workshop, we're going to run you through all the work that we're doing and how it interrelates. So that's the long answer to your question. The short answer is we've got some work to do on the central city. But yeah, maybe be helpful if we got to the second part. But if you have any thoughts on the key messages for the National Adaptation Plan submission, now is your time.
Sorry, is there a second
part? Yes, there is a second part. Yes. So part one is the NAP and part two is what our work program is over the next year or two.
Okay, that does mean we probably do have to speed up and focus on feedback on what we've already seen. So, Laurie.
Kia ora tātou, thank you for the amazing mahi. I've got three really quick questions. In terms of the submission, how will we be working regionally and acknowledging it's great to see that we are working with mana whenua as well, but how will we work with the regional councils as well?
I can take that one. Thanks for the question. We have done our best. When the NAP was released, with the councils across the region who are involved in the Wellington Regional Growth Framework had a discussion to see whether it might be possible for us to put in a submission on behalf of the region, but because of the short time frame of the submission window, it just was impossible to work within those timeframes. But there's certainly a lot of discussion happening across councils between officers, and we're certainly looking for opportunities to amplify the regional voice.
Great, thanks, Jamuna. Yeah, there's a big opportunity for alignment, bearing in mind. Yeah. So just also, I really want to support the point that local communities, that solutions or strategies should be as locally led as possible, given the diversity of each situation. And I'd really like to see us use examples of what council has already done in the submission. I'm sure you will, but I think the Mākara project is a really good one, including where we got to and why, and then what happened next and how that leads into government being more assertive with direction forward. And the next question is around, I think it was in the managed retreat section, around have we used the opportunity of recommending that we also look to natural infrastructure or soft green infrastructure as part of our defence, i.e. wetlands and what have you?
Yeah, so really excellent question as well. And I'm just trying to think, I can't quite remember where it is in the submission. I think may be in the National Adaptation Plan section, but we certainly will be supporting the framework that prioritises nature-based solutions. So there, as part of the strategic framework that the National Adaptation Plan is based on, that has come through relatively clearly, but we'll make sure that we put some detail in our submission on that.
Yeah, that's great, Jamuna. Thank you. I mean, it was interesting being at an Island Bay workshop and seeing that there was a stream with a wetland that the boats used to come in. And when you think now that there is a hard wall, that would be a really good example to get to show government, how we've changed the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. That's all from me.
Thank you, Laurie. We'll go to Jill, then Fleur, and then Jenny.
Oopsie, sorry, I'm just a bit distracted. My children's school's in a lockdown, so it doesn't sound very good. So hopefully I'm not repeating what someone else has just said. But my question's around the number 1 on the feedback slide. Is it that one? It's around community. Where is it? Get it up on my screen, around leadership and coordination, system-wide transformative change. One of the things that we're really aware in the community, and we're having that conversation today with Regional Council, Wellington City Council, split responsibilities. I guess, is there any way through this submission to sort of communicate that even with the reforms and trying to sort of overcome some of the boundary issues and kind of the silo effect that can happen, that needs to be considered, that, communities will, no matter where we kind of end up with boundaries, there will always potentially be split communities and people trying to navigate their particular issues or change and how they interface between different organisations that have some level of responsibility. And it seems to sort of transition across boundaries, but then also across different responsibilities. And then like the Wellington Water relationship with each regional council and Wellington City Council is different. And for the community, that's really hard to navigate. So it's really encouraging to hear that communities are going to be kind of at the centre and leading these processes. But I guess sometimes we can think we're creating a perfect new solution within, 3 water reforms. And I think, that's a good way forward, but I can still see that you won't be able to necessarily remove every way of
I think the intention of that bullet point is more about encouraging central government to answer some of those questions that are still not decided around about who decides and who pays. Because I completely agree, and it's very clear from the NAP that the central government also agrees that local government will lead and facilitate the development of dynamic adaptive pathways. So that is what local government is good at, right? Is like facilitating those kinds of complex conversations with communities. So it's clear that that's the role they intend us to play, but without giving that really clear leadership and coordination of some of those key questions and what the framework is that they want, that they are going to set up for us to deliver on. It's very hard for us to have those conversations. And that's what we saw at Makara.
Yeah, and communities
we didn't end up with a clear decision, and we didn't end up with a clear decision on who was going to pay for it.
And communities do. I mean, we've got it locally, and I imagine you experienced it too, where you kind of get told that, no, that's the regional council's responsibility, or no, that's this other council's responsibility. And at the end of the day, the community's kind of left looking into the distance going, who's going to help us? And I think that's the big thing people want to know. That's the clear leadership
that we're looking for from central government is, could you please sort that out a little bit for us so that it's clear what the framework is within which we're trying to have those conversations.
And then the other question was just around rivers and streams, because often when we think about the managed retreat, everyone's thinking about coastline, because that's kind of, I guess, the more dramatic side of it. But, we're having a meeting this morning about our community up in the north, and we haven't necessarily allowed enough space around these streams, so they're trying to find their own space. And that comes to kind of that planning around what you know about change over time. And, we're having officers explain to us today that rivers will change over time and they'll find new pathways, but we haven't let the built environment give space for that. And I guess it's hard to know how that translates into a community conversation.
So this is one of those cases where you have to leave flex both for the natural change but also flex for the unknown. So a very good example is LINZ, the Land Information Department up the road, is currently doing a project that will unify bathymetric information, so that's data that goes down into the sea, and topographic, so land. And the reason for that is those data are held completely separately. And so in a world where the coastline slides up and down, you have to recalculate both data sets constantly. That's the kind of unknown that we're having to face, and particularly with the aggradation of rivers, which is how they cut in and deposit. It's something that's not particularly well understood at a practical applied level yet.
Thank you.
Really interesting stuff. Fleur.
Yeah, I think you've answered part of my question, but I was really just wanting to give some feedback that we sort of admit some of our own failures and our own kind of, limitations. So I think about that marketer project, which was pitched to us as this incredible, world leading, we're going to engage, we're going to do all this stuff, and then it just stopped. And I sort of think it was pretty predictable what happened really. So it would be good if we just were kind of warts and all about it and shared that. But I also think in the Island Bay example as well, the community still are angry that the council suggested do nothing and just let it happen. And so I think that reflecting on that as a council in our submission to government, it's quite good to share that, where we got it wrong, as well as some of the interesting technology and stuff that we've got to get it right. So I'm quite keen that the council sort of puts a warts and all. And the other piece of feedback that I really want to give is we have a lot of specialists throughout the council who have a lot of ideas about law reform needed to reduce emissions. And I just would want to sort of pitch that you go broad in terms of asking the consenting team, but there are others as well, the transport team, there are even the heritage people, about what they can see as barriers to reducing emissions now and what they want to see in terms of law reform, because it's our chance to share our expertise as a council.
Yeah, our submission definitely is we're going broad to a wide variety of officers internally, and that applies to this submission. It also applies to the development of our adaptation strategy, because you're right, there's deep expertise across many, many parts of council, and there's a lot of different moving parts of how climate change impacts on our communities and on our assets and how we're going to coordinate them.
Cool. Jenny.
Thanks. I'm just going to jump on after Jill, because I had river flooding here as that we need to bring that into the conversation because we focus so much on coastal hazards. The other thing I wanted to bring into the conversation is unsecured slopes and slips, because I know from a council infrastructure point of view, if you think about our roads and what keeps Brad awake at night, when I talk to Brad Singh about climate change adaptation, and I'm always going seawalls, 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 and he's like, no, Jenny, we're actually pretty good on seawalls. It's slips. It's Naya Gorge. That's where we're really, really vulnerable. So that's something that I would like to see is the adaptation doesn't get swallowed up by coastal hazards, but we put all of the adaptation things and make sure that they're all kind of getting equal focus, because they're all going to create similar problems in different places, right? I guess one of the things that's kind of coming to me while I've been listening to all of this is just what is the key principle that kind of underlies the idea of adaptation and retreat, because there are a number of different things that we're kind of trying to juggle here. Are we trying to minimise economic loss? Are we trying to deliver economic benefits? Are we trying to maintain current levels of infrastructure service to every house that currently exists? What is it that we're trying to deliver? Because, for example, I totally support the focus on nature-based solutions, but they require more physical space and land to deliver, which means that councils would have to buy more space and land to be able to provide them. And that there are trade-offs there. And I guess I also kind of think about, we often don't worry about, but retreating too soon increases the economic loss. There's no point bowling buildings that'll actually be fine for the next 30 years. We don't want to bowl them before their time. So it's also thinking about how are we having that conversation and balance about all of these, how these different principles are going to interact, because those are key issues, and again, a right-wing government would take probably a different approach to a left-wing government about how we would look at adaptation in terms of private property rights, minimising economic loss, all of those sorts of things. And I guess one of my biggest concerns is that this doesn't become a political football, that adaptation becomes something that's relatively, that our pathway forward is actually relatively agreed across some of the political spectrum, because otherwise it's not actually going to help us that much if we keep flipping every 6 years or 9 years back and forth between what we're trying to achieve. So all of those are very kind of high level comments. I've got lots of detailed ones that I can just email, but that's kind of where my thinking is at.
No, thank you for that. It's really valuable feedback as we go into designing the adaptation plan going forward.
I think that's quite a good point to add into the submission, is it'd be really great if government worked towards a cross-party agreement on this kind of stuff, because it is really, really long term. I don't know if there's a point there about that at the minute.
And sometimes I think the solutions that might minimise economic loss or that create the least disruption to private property owners in the short term are the ones that create the most biodiversity damage.
Okay, so establishing some universal principles that
potentially
that helps us,
or at least to understand that there are genuine trade-offs here, right? We know that a seawall...
We won't say what they are, but we say we need them, yeah?
Yeah. We can't get away from the fact that a seawall might have less financial effect on the landowners who sit behind that seawall, but it will have more biodiversity. It will create more biodiversity damage. Nature-based solutions which provide better biodiversity outcomes require more land, which requires us to, there are genuine issues in here, and you can go about, I guess my key thing is always you can go about adaptation more than one way, and your political views will kind of affect how you might see that.
Yeah, so to Sean's point about, complex systems, these are very complex systems. The MFE guidance on best practice, they've got a wheel of best practice of kind of developing a dynamic adaptive pathway, it sort of takes all of those things into account. So points well noted. And I think dynamic adaptive pathways is what we really talk about in terms of understanding the potential pathways and what the decision-making triggers are to then choosing at each of those triggers what path you're going to take, and allowing flexibility for that to change over time as well. What adaptation isn't is making one decision at one point in time and spending a crap ton of money to deliver it, right? So it's about working over time in a really complex and dynamic way.
Great. Well, I think we've come to the end of the questions, and I know that we will need time for your second half, so let's move on.
To the point, though, that if we do run out of time, that's okay, because as Caden said, this is just the first of many conversations that we're going to have about adaptation over the next sort of 18 months. And if we run out of time today, we'll just book another workshop in with you to continue getting your feedback as we go.
My only contribution was on the funding, really. If we have got a bit of time, I'll just put this in. And I couldn't help but think of Councillor Pannett's wish to have a climate defence fund. But it just comes into that broader conversation about how do you split but strengthening that bit, as we already discussed, I think is really important. Asking the government to do some more thinking about how this could all be funded and what's fair. But okay, that's my bit. Right.
Ka pai. Well, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you very much for all the questions. Some really, really good things to consider there. And again, like Alison said, not a one-off conversation. More than happy to take questions after and continue the conversation on. So what we're going to do now is move to the second part of the workshop, which is more of a focus on Te Atakura, our climate change adaptation plan, and some of the work streams and mahi that we have going on within the team. So Jamuna, I'm going to hand it over to you to kick that off. Kia ora.
Thanks, Caden. Also, I just wanted to check. I can see that there's something in the chat there. I haven't checked it yet, but
It's just Iona schooling me on Island.
Okay, cool. We haven't.
I'm happy to receive it.
I just wanted to make sure that we're addressing all of the points coming through. Thanks for that discussion. That was actually a really, really helpful discussion, I think, for this next part of the workshop, which is all about an update on what we've been doing under the Te Atakura adaptation work plan. I know that you'll probably be quite eager to hear what we've been up to over the last few months. So this next section is just to give you some more clarity on what we're planning and what we're working on. So just to kind of recontextualise Te Ata Kura and where the adaptation workstream fits in. Obviously, it sits alongside the really important mahi in the mitigation space. We know that, unfortunately, that we're going to have to adapt to the unavoidable impacts of climate change over the next coming decades, but it certainly I guess, strengthens the reason for why we need to rapidly decarbonise as quickly as possible to avoid as many of the unfortunate outcomes for our communities. So what we're working on is an adaptation approach that encompasses both the city, the wider city, as well as what we do as council. So we've been asked to develop a citywide adaptation plan that will really help us address climate change adaptation at scale. So not just, I guess, look at really localised project by project or even community by community, but we know that we need to think about the city as a whole and how it comes together. And we are going to be taking a really community-centric approach to this adaptation plan because we know that engaging the community is really central to us being able to make good decisions that balance values for our communities effectively. And in terms of the council aspect of climate adaptation, this is primarily focused on how we adapt council to the impacts of climate change. So particularly thinking about our assets and services, how we run our systems and processes. And so with all of the other work under Te Ata Kura, we know that we need to build on the best available scientific evidence to do this, and we're in a really good place to be working from today. We also know that building on Mātauranga Māori is going to be an increasingly more important part of developing the strategy, and really looking forward to discussions about how we can involve mana whenua in the design and development of our adaptation plan and I guess the co-governance of the implementation phase as well. Of course, with the community-centric approach, I guess we come at this from a perspective where communities, that we need to build partnerships with our communities, and thinking about the first part of this workshop, there's some really important mahi to do in the advocacy space as well to make sure that we have a robust, supportive policy environment in which we can actually select good adaptation options, implement them with funding, and make sure that they're effective in the longer term. So a really important framework that we've already talked about a fair bit today that really sets the core foundations of the thinking around the adaptation approach is the dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach. It comes out of the Ministry for Environment Coastal Hazards Guidelines, and it is generally just best practice for climate change adaptation. I'm sure you've seen examples of what the pathways can look like. This is just an example of where we need to plan for multiple futures and having multiple options that we might want to draw on over time. So the way that we apply the dynamic adaptive policy pathways approach, so we go through a whole process of trying to understand what our greatest risks are, prioritising those and identifying adaptation options. This is, and we know for Wellington that there are a whole range of options, but we also have a lot of work to do, I'd say, to really make sure that we are able to select the best options that will support the long-term resilience of the city. So we know that there's a whole lot of things that we could do to protect the coastal areas. For example, there are different strategies that we could employ, from upgrading our seawalls right through to restoration of the coastal environment. But what we need to help us make those big decisions is a clear framework for how to make the best decision. So this next little section of the presentation is just to give you an understanding of some of the key steps that we'll be considering in developing the adaptation plan, which is a bit of we've got a 4-step process. And these steps will we'll be working through over the next couple of years to make sure that we've got an adaptation plan to work from. So these 4 steps are informed by the Ministry for Environment's Coastal Hazards Guide, the draft National Adaptation Plan, and the IPCC's latest adaptation report. And so I'll just walk you through the key steps in a moment, but really the point is to develop an adaptation plan that gives us a really firm strategic approach to adaptation that helps us work through the complex set of challenges in the short, medium and long term. And will give us a clear direction for the pathway forward and allow us to collaborate and coordinate the work across the city and across the wider region. So the first stage is about understanding the impacts and vulnerabilities. And we know that we've already got really good information in this area. For example, we've got the new hazard maps that are part of the draft district plan. But we are doing some extra work in this space to understand the wider impacts on the city. We're currently working on a project with the other councils in the Wellington region to complete the Wellington Regional Climate Change Impact Assessment. And I will walk you through that project in a bit of detail after we get through the rest of this process, just so that you can hear more about what's coming up in that area. So the second stage that we're developing at the same time is the decision-making framework for adaptation. So as mentioned, there's a range of other best practice guidelines that we'll be drawing on to build the decision-making framework for council. So building on the best information from the Ministry for Environment, including the new National Adaptation Plan. But there's also some other projects happening regionally that we can also draw on. So there's the impact assessment that I just mentioned, as well as the regional adaptation plan that will be the next phase of that regional work. But really importantly, we need to link the adaptation plan to the other strategic work of council, so making sure that it's firmly embedded in our city tomorrow, and taking on board exciting new developments like the Tupiki Ora Māori strategy to make sure that we've got good alignment. And yeah, just building on actually the conversation earlier around having clear principles, this will be something that we will be looking forward to coming back to talk to you further about at another workshop. But we know that we'll have to come up with a set of clear guiding principles to help us navigate all of the complexity of adapting, making the decisions around how to adapt to climate change. We've already started some of this work internally with other officers, but there's a lot of opportunity to build on the draft National Adaptation Plan that's just come out as well. Oops. So the third stage will be about developing the adaptation plan. So that will include a strategic framework as well as practical actions for council to do to work towards adaptation. A really key part of this approach will be to ensure that there is a scalable approach so that the framework that we're setting out for the city as a whole will link and marry up with an approach to develop more localised adaptation plans. And there's some examples of this kind of approach in other areas. I guess the Hawke's Bay example is probably a very well-known example of developing those more localised adaptation plans. So that's something that we're looking to incorporate as well. And then the final phase is obviously more focused on doing. So once we have a plan, hopefully we can get to the stage where we can implement some actions. And this will be, I guess, the implementation, monitoring and review will cut across a way of working that will be really mainstreamed across council. So we'll need to be able to put in funding bids for the long-term plan, but also there'll be a lot of actions that will fall into the infrastructure plan as well. And just to give you a little bit of a snapshot of I guess the way I've seen this is it's like a spider web.
I think that's your system thinking at play, isn't it, Jamuna?
Yes.
Yes, good. All right.
A mainstreamed approach to how adaptation will fit into the wider work of council. So we will have an adaptation plan that will be like the brains and have the centralised plan, but this plan will very much link through to the wider strategies of council as well. And really importantly, link back down to the work that, so the planning at a more localised level as well.
And I think the main point that I would take from this spider diagram is that there is both an awful lot of central government and regional policy that will feed into our adaptation plan. We are trying to influence regional policy through the regional impact assessment plus the regional adaptation planning, which we are project managing on behalf of the Regional Leadership Committee. And also that then our adaptation plan will also inform a whole lot of other council policies and be integrated into them, including the long-term plan. So there's kind of two-way streets between a lot of these sort of documents. So this is local government. It's a complex web of different kind of policies and frameworks and thoughts, but that speaks to the complexity of the work. But really what we're trying to get to is to be in a place where we're really clear about what central government has as their plan, that we're really shaping what that regional plan is, and then able to deliver our role as facilitators of those local adaptation plans. I like the 4 circles better. The spider diagram freaks me out.
Yeah, sorry, I realise it's probably stressful for other people who don't see the world in the same way as me.
We're with you on your journey, though, Jamuna. That's good.
Thank you. Yeah, and just picking up on your point, Alison, around the amount of change in the wider policy area. I've tried to put those dotted lines around some of the circles to show things that are in development, which is actually the majority of the key building blocks for the adaptation plan, which makes it rather challenging as the context around us is changing.
We do have a few questions.
Oh, please.
All right, so we've got Tam and we've got Iona and Jenny. We'll start with those.
Well, thanks, Jamuna. This is really cool. I was wondering, maybe it's probably a question for Caden, in regards to the slideshow, how I saw Mātauranga Māori is obviously like one of those key foundations in the Te Atakura planning, and so I wondered how that's going to feed in, and will you guys draw on existing knowledge that's already out there, because there's quite a lot of stuff that's been done internationally around like Indigenous climate adaptation, and it would be really good to see that in there and know who you've referenced in order to get that knowledge, because people say Mātauranga Māori, but then they never really say where it comes from, and that's always random.
Yes.
Cool. Ka pai hoa. Thank you for the question. I think there's a couple of layers to that one as well, and noting that this stream in particular is very much at the starting point of building on Mātauranga Māori and building the stream in general. I think some of the important things that have come out of Council recently, particularly Takaihere and Tupiki Ora, the 10-year Māori strategy, those two elements are going to be huge for us in navigating what the structure looks like for integrating Mātauranga Māori. So that's going to be a key component, not just across climate change adaptation, but climate change response in general. So that's something that needs to be figured out first before we start running out to mana whenua seeking advice, because the last thing that we'd want to do is go out with 10 different projects all at different times and overwhelm an already under-resourced set of organisations in iwi. So we need to look internally first and figure out what that structure is going to look like, and we're in the process of doing that now, and then start integrating that into the different streams. So I hope that answers your question. Kia ora.
Yeah, and I just got one other one, Sarah. That does answer my question. Thank you, Caden. And yeah, I guess with that capacity issue for mana whenua, that's kind of why I was suggesting there's so much knowledge out there that people who are shaping that policy can draw on without burdening anyone else. The other question I wanted to ask was, or point I wanted to make is, in our adaptation plans, can we have some job opportunities in there for young people, especially like rangatahi Māori? Because I've got a mate who does planting for Porirua City Council. I've got another mate that does conservation and planting for Ngāti Toa, and it seems like rangatahi Māori are real into conservation jobs, and so I wondered, in our planning, can we consider green jobs? I know central government provide funding for green jobs, and I'd love to see opportunities for young people in our adaptation planning if we're doing like coastal planting and stuff like that. But anyway, just wanted to plug that.
There is a section even in the National Adaptation Plan in the draft that talks about supporting jobs for nature. Might not have got the wording right, but I thought you might be interested that there is a section on that at the national level. But I think this is a really good example of how we need to think holistically about our adaptation approach, because there's certainly a lot that we can do to build resilience in a whole lot of different ways. And I just thought I would add one more thing in relation to your question around Mātauranga Māori. and I will explain a little bit more about the work that we're doing regionally, but just wanted to let you know that regionally we're coordinating with other councils under the Wellington Regional Growth Framework to do a stock take of the past engagements with mana whenua on climate change to support us with the work that we're hoping to involve them with over the next couple of years as well. So yeah, really, really keen to reduce the burden on mana whenua as much as possible, and really glad you brought that up.
Thank you, that's great to hear. Is that Tam, have you finished with your questions? Great. Okay, Iona.
Thanks for that. My question's around engagement. So you'll have seen the survey results which showed that actually there's really only quite a small number of Kiwis who will take action on climate change. And I was just thinking about Councillor Fitzsimon's point around the island-based seawall was really interesting, because actually at that time we were having a debate over whether we took a cheaper option and a heritage option and rebuilt a wall, or whether we did a more expensive natural solution. So there was really good discussion around that. And probably I think the right decision was made just to rebuild it, actually, just given we don't need to do anything right now. But nevertheless, that's a really tough conversation to have with communities. If you've got a cheap solution like $1 million, but the better solution from a climate perspective is $6 million, then how do you have that conversation with people? Because ultimately, you know, whatever the split of the money is, it all really comes from individuals and businesses. It's not government, because the government is only there because people pay it and have to pay it.
I think the first thing I would say is that I think we need to think really carefully about how we engage communities in adaptation in general, given the uncertainty around the funding. And this is going to be, I guess, a key part of what our team is going to be focusing on at the moment, is to try and understand how can we have productive conversations with community, engage them in a meaningful process, knowing that there are some limitations around the funding to do adaptation. So I'm not sure that this really answers your question, but I guess just noting the sensitivity and complexity of funding and the engagement.
I guess my point is that we will need a very, very good engagement strategy. So Jenny, I'm sure we'll talk about kapiti more intelligently than me, that it's a difficult one, even when people like me just go, oh, for goodness sake, it's so obvious, we have to take action, right? And it's frustrating when people don't get it, but that's obviously not working as an approach.
Well, that once again is one of those, pieces of our feedback for the NAP and asking for strong national leadership, is that experience of Kapiti Coast kind of put the wind up local governments up and down the country, and kind of raise the question of how do you put that information on the limb, and how do you publicise that information, and how do you increase awareness about the hazards without tanking property values, and kind of bring to a point the question of who pays before that central government policy is in place. So central government really need to answer several of those questions all at the one time, which I think is why the Climate Change Adaptation Act is taking a while, because it's quite complicated. So here's hoping it has everything that we want in it, and that will be part of our feedback on the NAP, will be great start. Here's all the rest of the stuff that we want and need so that we can do a good job on behalf of local communities in this.
Yeah. Jenny.
Thank you. For those of you who don't know, my father at one time was the president of the Coastal Ratepayers Association in Kapiti Coast, and successfully was part of the group that took them to council over the coastal hazards. They own a property on Marine Parade, so that's why all the conversation about me knowing a bit about Kapiti. But it is interesting to actually kind of understand the different factions within that group, because I think they're often portrayed as one monolithic faction, but actually there are a number of different people with different motivations within that group, as with any group, right? I guess I'm a lot more cynical about what's going to come out of central government. I don't expect them to actually provide the leadership that we're asking for, and so I guess where I'm coming from is then what, right? So I think it's great. We should push and ask. But I also want to know what plan B is when, if my cynicism is repaid in reality, and we don't get the direction we're looking for, that we don't just go, oh, well, I guess we're not going to do anything. So that's kind of, and that's, I guess, where our work on our adaptation is really important, because that to me kind of says, well, this is what we can do regardless of what central government doesn't provide.
I agree, and one of the things that's on our work program is to look at what our regulatory and legal options are under the current system.
That would be my question.
And what our funding and financing options are under the current frameworks. Just so that we can we've done some of that research, in that we've already researched what other councils have done up and down New Zealand, but I'd really like to get a legal or planning point of view on those questions, so that we can be really clear that if the central government doesn't deliver that level of clarity, we at least know what we're able to and not able to do.
Because I keep wondering things like, if we want to build a seawall somewhere or coastal defences, can we use the Public Works Act to buy that land? I just don't know. Like under the current example, if we wanted to start charging a seawalls targeted rate,
can we?
Can we just go out and charge, every homeowner that's protected by a council seawall?
And I'm really interested in
a small percentage of that cost.
Yeah, I'm really interested in how you preserve people's connection to place, even as you start to dial back the protection of the road. When does a house become a batch, and are you actually under regulatory settings that we currently have? Is that even something that we could contemplate, or is something that would need legislative change? So those are the sorts of questions I would like to understand.
And I think one of the big issues in Kapiti amongst those groups is that there were some people who were just climate deniers, who were just like, this is just not going to happen, so go away. Then there's a group of people who are just like, oh, I expect the council to protect my property no matter what, right? And then there are other people who were more concerned, who are like, yes, eventually at some point my property is going to become untenable, but they're worried about that early retreat. Do you know what I mean? Like, so they're concerned that the council's going to go too far too fast. And there's been some examples. Was it in Gisborne? There's somewhere where houses were near a river that flooded, and the council's now said you just can't live there anymore, even though possibly those houses will still be habitable for another 10 or 15 or 20 years. So it's that, there are different concerns amongst those groups of people, and one of the concerns is the risk of early retreat.
Yeah, and that's one of the reasons why we want to advocate for central government to give flexibility of regulatory instruments, because at the moment some of our instruments are very blunt.
Yeah.
So this sounds like, reframing it as a question, it sounds like, can we make sure that's reflected well in the submission?
Yeah,
definitely.
And in our own adaptation plan.
Yeah.
But so I think it's, the other thing I would say is, I guess I've got quite a focus, very interested in the issues around coastal communities, but also very interested in our own assets, essentially, as asset owner, and that there are a number of decisions that we might have to make while this policy work is ongoing. And so that's kind of one of the things, because I know, the mass rapid transit route for Let's Get Wellington Moving goes down the Keys, and is going to have impacts and expectations about the harbour seawall, for example, over the next 100 years. And whenever I raise that, people say, oh, the designs have it up to this Mount sea level rise, don't worry about it. We're not at that stage of the design yet, which is fine. But, these are live projects that we're making significant decisions on. The airport seawall is another one. We've also had this issue with NZTA refusing to fund our retaining wall strengthening projects, partly because I think they've been framed as earthquake resilience projects, but increasingly they're going to become climate resilience projects. So, I guess I have a lot of questions, particularly then about, those assets and live decisions that we're making right now, and how we will be able to kind of incorporate adaptation while we're waiting for the policy work, which I understand takes a long time to make its way through.
So, at present, we're about to begin work on the infrastructure strategy, which goes with the long-term plan. These are exactly the types of issues we have to confront in the construction of that. For example, what effect will climate change have on renewal curves, and how is that factored in through accounting standards, etc. These are questions I don't yet know the answer to myself, and part of strategy is understanding your purpose. The other is how an institution learns, and we're very much in that latter territory.
Okay, I think that's been really good reflections and just more points brought up. Have you got more? Yeah, and I've seen Tam, but we've actually, I think, Robin, did you want to have a question?
Briefly, just an incredibly high-level comment as I'm sitting here reflecting on it, and probably not so much wearing a very localised hat, but the fact that I've got a law and a philosophy degree. I kind of wonder how much we're recognising under this the limitations of our current legal property ownership system, which came from England, as in we're highly individualistic and was developed, essentially hundreds of years ago when there were very few landowners and there were quite big ones, and now we've come down to a lot of property rights at a big picture have come down to very small parcels of land, and then when we go to, like the meeting this morning, when we're talking about streamside properties and you have to try and get a collective agreement of even 3 or 4, is how do you do that? And so whatever political road that ends up going down, that would be quite a useful, clear signal to send to government, is that for as long as we've got a highly English, not adapted to climate change or Aotearoa or anything, private land ownership model that's just so strong, and to take a broader picture of that, when I'm talking planning with, say, local business people, even right-wing business people locally make comments like, well, we'd like to be able to say locally we don't want 3 $2 shops in our town centre, but there's nothing under our current planning because it's based on such individualistic property ownership rights to be able to do that kind of planning, and that translates across to this kind of planning as well. We've got nothing there because the fundamental building block is not the Māori model, which was here, which would probably flex far better for climate change, but it's this imported model which isn't flexing, and for as long as we've got that unadapted model, we're going to have just one headache after another. So I think that needs to be recognised quite clearly at some point. And I'm not a councillor, so councillors who say, it's not really my voice, but that's just my reflection as I'm sitting here, is that's the very high level problem that's going to be just headbutting the entire way through. And you have to recognise that we're going to accept that that's what we're going to have to keep headbutting against, because if people recognise that, they might have more appetite for change in terms of seeing the benefits of collective action versus losing a few rights, I guess.
Yeah.
SNA's come into this space of people's belief on their unfettered rights to their property, and we had an interesting, was it Paul Blaschke, who in his submission to the group that I was on through the annual plan, he said, we already have rules on what we can and can't do in our property, but people sort of don't seem to understand why or have that kind of connection with it. But it fits so much with that around, well, you own your property for a period of time, but then goes to someone else, or but yeah, it is a challenge.
No, good point, and I think the government have that on their radar, but it'd be good to encourage them to be courageous as they think about it.
I've actually got a question, then I'll go back to Tam for a second question. My question was about our role, I think you showed in that web, the spider web, our role actually in crafting or coordinating the regional adaptation plan. And I guess I just got a couple of questions. Is how did that become our role? Not saying it's a bad thing. And how well prepared are we to actually do that for regions or areas that are well beyond our city's limits?
Jamuna, do you want to take us on a whistle-stop tour of the regional impact assessment? Would that be interesting?
Yes.
To you? Yeah.
Yes, because it's all connected. The short answer is who leads the regional adaptation plan that will follow this first stage of the regional impact assessment is unknown at this stage, but we're talking with the other councils in the region. But what I will do now, if it's appropriate, I will just take you through a few slides about this project. Just double checking that's sorry, because I can't see you.
We've only got 15 minutes. So Tam, was your question quite quite brief before we launch into a bit more of a presentation mode?
Yeah, I can make it brief. Basically, I was just, because Jenny brought up talked about lots of things, but the seawalls and the airport, and I'm obviously I did the thing last year with the removing the money from the LTP for that seawall, because it really wasn't clear that that was a seawall, because we got the email from the airport chair at the time in the morning saying this is for the extension. And so can we get in the next briefing, like you're saying, Alison, a really clear explanation on that, the airport seawall, and also just the airport in general, like, and how they're impacted by adaptation, because they're super low lying and they've got their expansion plans. And I'm interested to know how the modelling, especially this new stuff on how fast it's happening, impacts the airport and how we're thinking about them. So that'd be helpful in the adaptation space.
Thanks, Tam. I kind of support that, because they're now saying that you have to have the seawall before you have the extension. So they're clearly a little bit connected, but that is a good point. A bit of a segue, but a good point. So now if we can segue again
yes.
back to the regional adaptation plan. And
Yep.
we've only got just a little under 15 minutes.
Yes, so I'm going to skip through a few slides just to forewarn you on that. But the airport is a really good segue and a good example of what we're trying to do with this work. We've already been in discussions with people at the airport about how to make this work useful for not just councils in the region, but for stakeholders and community more widely. But this piece of work is currently underway. So the Regional Climate Change Impact Assessment is part of the Wellington Regional Growth Framework. And so there are partners, so other local councils, as well as mana whenua and some central government agencies who are part of the wider work on the growth framework. The Climate Change Impact Assessment is really focusing on, it's like a climate change risk assessment 2.0. We're really challenging ourselves to really understand the impacts of climate change in much greater detail. And we're really excited to have a really awesome team of experts in the climate change space working with us on this project. So we have the team from Becca, NIWA and GNS working with us to deliver the regional impact assessment. And we've chosen this team of people because they not only are they heavy hitters in terms of climate science and thought leadership around adaptation planning, but there's a huge number of experts representing some really, I guess the focus is on interdisciplinary understandings of climate change. So we're wanting to understand in some detail the impacts on the natural environment, the wider community, the built environment, our economy, and even thinking about some of those governance risks like we've been talking about earlier. So the team is currently pulling together a whole range of existing information that councils and other organisations already have on climate change, and they are developing a bespoke methodology building on best practice guidelines from Ministry for Environment, pulling in the latest guidelines from the IPCC's latest adaptation report and the framework for understanding climate change risks. And they are working towards a deadline of the end of the year to develop a climate change impact assessment, including a risk mapping tool, which is pretty exciting. Another exciting aspect to this is that we're looking to involve mana whenua in the design and delivery of this project as much as possible. So yeah, lots of work in that space as well. And the work that we're doing as part of that project also links into this other project that Sean mentioned earlier, the Bloomberg Mayor's Challenge, or we quite often call it the Bloomberg Project, which doesn't really say a lot about what it really is, but I guess it acknowledges where the funding for this project comes from. So as you probably know, we were the recipients of funding from Bloomberg Philanthropies to bring our idea around developing a climate change engagement tool to life. So this project is going to take 3 years for us to design and deliver. And our concept is to use the digital twin to build a two-way engagement platform that will help us to have these really complex conversations with the community. We know that, like we've talked about today, there's a huge amount of complex information that needs to be considered in good adaptation decision making. So we are trying to make that more accessible, more available to the community so that we can work together to understand how we can best adapt to climate change in a collaborative approach. And like was mentioned before, a really key part of this piece of work will be thorough engagement planning, even though there's lots of other work streams that are very complex. Working through how this applies in a democratic setting is going to be really, really critical, and an early action that we'll be working on this year. But I thought I'd just show you, hopefully this can play, and you may have already seen this before, but just in case you haven't, I'll try to change the resolution. I'm not sure how clearly it's coming through, but this is
That's pretty good.
Pretty good? Okay, cool. This is a sample of the hyper-realistic digital version of Wellington. Sorry, trying to get it to play. That we'll be using for this project. So there's an amazing team working on, this is the base model, and Sean, please feel free to chime in. But we'll be using this model to develop a experience for Wellingtonians to be able to help us adapt to climate change.
That's great. I think that's fantastic. It's rather a lot to take in, but it's fantastic. I think we probably, we are on wrap up, so that, and I did notice there's also tea and coffee down the back, which we may have 1 or 2 minutes to grab a cup.
I'll just leave you with one final slide, which is just I guess just to give you some understanding of how we're trying to align the work that we're doing here locally with the changes that are happening in the central government policy pipeline. So trying to balance alignment with what's happening in the bigger picture with trying to take action locally, and that there's a number of different projects that we're working on concurrently to try and make it all happen and come together relatively seamlessly as possible. But yeah, I'll leave it there. And I know we've only got a couple of minutes, but if there are any further questions, really happy to take them.
Yeah, so I'm not seeing any, and I think we've probably all got quite a bit to digest and
maxed out on content there.
Yeah, I'm sure there will be some, but if so, perhaps they can be, people can just email or have a conversation with one of our lovely staff at our leisure. But thank you. I'd just, on behalf of everyone, really like to thank you. It's a huge amount of work. Very exciting. We'll go back to try and find a time when we perhaps can bring the submission to committee, but we obviously need to work quite quickly. And that may or may not be possible.
I got an email that it is on the forward program for the 26th of May
Okay.
for a council meeting. And then any changes that are made out of that, Iona, if you could sign them off.
Okay.
So if any changes come out of there.
Wonderful. Okay. Thank you to everybody who's taken part. Those of us who are here can have a cup of tea.
Laurie's got her hand up.
Oh, Laurie. It'll have to be super fast. Yep.
Thank you for the timeline. How have we taken local communities that are already feeling impacts into that work? What priority will they be given in terms of timing?
Great question. I guess we are looking for all opportunities to start working with local communities as much as possible. One example, and I think is a really exciting opportunity for us as part of the Bloomberg project to start engaging with communities to not only co-design what the tool will look like, but to help start exploring the wider engagement plan around the adaptation work. So that's an immediate opportunity that we have.
Right. Well, thank you again. I think that does actually bring us to an end, I think. Okay, thank you. Great.
I think I'll just wrap this up with karakia, since we opened with karakia just before we close off. Well, ngamihi kia koutou, thank you all for attending. It was an amazing conversation. Me karakia tātou. Kia tau kia tātou katoa, te ata whai o te tātou arakia ihu karaiti, me te aroha o te atua me te whiwhinga tahitanga, ki te wairua tapu, ake, āmini. Kia ora.